Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 101, The True Value Needed. Azij's body was like a broken ragged sack. The peasants picked it up and burned it. There had been no peace between races. Cant would never let go of this high-level Jack Allen who were aware of itself, especially when Azij showed the wisdom and mind of a human. It was destined to die no matter what. Because Cant needed it to tell him about the situation on the Mannheim coast. When he understood the details, its true value was gone. Cant didn't care about the situation in the Kingdom of Greymane and the Mannheim coast that it described. He only needed to know that there was indeed such a place on the other side of the Naran Desert. This reminded him of the Middle East desert. Merchants from the Middle East crossed the desert to the eastern Mediterranean coast and sold their goods to European merchants. This was an extremely profitable trade. In particular, Cant controlled salt mines and could produce large amounts of high-quality white salt. This allowed the trade to continue because the Jack Allen of the Kingdom of Greymane was not the only species on the Mannheim coast. There was also the Kingdom of Lizardmen, which thrived in the sea trade, and the Elven Parliament, which was a colony. After offending the Jack Allen, there were also these two races. Cant, who came from the southern part of the Naran Desert, was a merchant who had come from afar. He was a trustworthy friend, and definitely not someone who was close at hand and tried to destroy other race forces at any time. The principle of befriend a distant state and strike a neighboring one was prevalent in every world. Moreover, no one would be foolish enough to start a war across the natural moat of the Naran Desert. After all, humans didn't have high endurance like the Jack Allens. This was the reason why Manad was optimistic about it. As a Nord who had crossed the sea to the continent of Karadia, he understood this principle. This was because the desert was not the sea, it could not be reached by the wind and waves. As long as the Oasis lookout maintained friendly trade with the races of the Mannheim coast, they could even do business with the Kingdom of Greymane. When it came to profits, hatred was only the means of the politicians. Of course, before that, they would have to defeat the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane in the Naran Desert. Otherwise, if the army occupied the Oasis lookout, it would be an absolute failure for Cant and the others. Cant needed to win a victory and prove his ability in front of the forces of the Mannheim coast. The weaks could not protect their own benefits. In the council hall, Cant had a conversation with Manad and Firentus cautiously. Since he had already decided to take this path, he should plan as soon as possible. Especially when dealing with the Jack Allen the Kingdom of Greymane, who could attack at any time, he also needed to prepare as soon as possible. Just as the three of them were talking, the sound of hurried horse hooves came from outside the wooden door. Sarrandian horseman pushed the door open and entered. He bowed respectfully and reported, "My lord, we have returned from our patrol." Very good." Cant nodded. 5 Sarrandian horsemen led a cavalry team of 40 desert bandits. Even if a 46 Swadian heavy cavalry had to be careful when they encountered them. After all, these light cavalry soldiers with short javelins could not win in close combat. But they could fight and run at the same time. Harassing them like flies was very simple for the bandits from the Sarrandian desert. We also captured a group of Jack Allen. Sarrandian horsemen continued to report. How many? Cant asked. About 120. They are relatively difficult to capture. We killed more than 300 Jack Allens before these guys surrendered out of fear. Sarrandian horseman shrugged and said with a regretful tone, "Otherwise, we could have captured more." However, Cant was slightly stunned and asked, "Captured 120 of them?" "That's right." Sarrandian horseman nodded affirmatively. Cant could not help but praise, "Well done." He did expect that these bandits with scimitar would have no problem killing the scattered Jack Allens. However, he did not expect that they could actually capture 120 Jack Allens. According to the calculation, each Jack Allen worth 30 dinars, it would bring Cant 3,600 dinars. The captive trading is indeed profitable. Cant could not help but sigh. At the same time, he instructed the Sarrandian horsemen, bring them to the training ground and keep an eye on them. Understood. The Sarrandian horseman left after receiving the order. However, Kant also felt a little regretful. He said to Manit and Firentis, I suddenly regret killing that high-level Jack Allen, Asaj. I really don't know how much dinar he can sell for. When the Jack Allen Expeditionary Army arrives, we will know. Manit smiled and comforted him. The Naran Desert would exhaust the last strength of the Jack Allen Expeditionary Army. Kant and the others, who were defending the fortress, could literally watch and wait for the Jack Allens struggling. At their weakest moment, Kant's soldiers could launch a fatal attack and win. This was Kant and the others' strategic plan. Let's go out and take a look. Kant stood up and walked outside. Manit and Firentis also stood up and followed behind. So many Jack Allen captives were indeed good news. When the trade caravan of Vaidyr arrived, they would replenish Kant's half-used dinar savings. They walked out of the council hall. Kant walked along the street. The 5-meter-high city wall blocked his view from afar. The endless sea of sand that could be seen at any time was now blocked by the city wall. He could not admire it whenever he wanted. This might be a pity. However, Kant shook his head with a smile and shook off the thoughts in his head. If not for these city walls, he would probably have been forced to withdraw from the Oasis lookout. They couldn't defeat the invading and plundering Jack Allen expedition army on their own. So, they forced to invite the wolves into their house, attracting the noble families from Dukedom of Leo to come over here and help them. Only then, they could barely stop the Jack Allen. The wall was their safety measure. Walking to the training ground in the eastern military zone, over 100 Jack Allens were squatting there with their hands and feet tied up by hemp ropes. Groups of desert bandits were waiting beside their horses. There were some rude desert bandits were riding on their horses. They were holding scimitars and circling around the Jack Allen captives. They were showing off their power, saying bad jokes and dirty jokes, which immediately made the desert bandits laugh out loud. However, it made the Jack Allen captives look even more pitiful. Why do I think I'm the villain in a drama? Kant shrugged helplessly. Firentis didn't answer, while Manit nodded affirmatively. Look at these little cuties, they are indeed pitiful. I think we shouldn't mistreat them. After all, they are walking dinars. I like this saying. Kant nodded with a smile. The desert bandits quickly walked over, and they also noticed Kant. All of them quickly bowed and greeted Kant respectfully. At the same time, they waited for the orders solemnly. You all did well. Looking at the respectful manner of these desert bandits, Kant nodded to himself. At the same time, he asked, were there any casualties during the process? No, Lord. They are as weak as chickens, one of the desert bandits answered. Everyone immediately burst into laughter. However, because Kant was here, all of them appeared to be very polite. Although they were bandits, they were also bandits who had been recruited by Kant. They had to left behind their bad images in behind and did not want to show it in front of their lord. Kant did not mind that they held back their rudeness. It was good that there were no casualties. The light cavalry formed by these desert bandits was one of his trump cards. It was not worth having any casualty. Keep an eye on them, Kant ordered these desert bandits. Turning to Manit behind him, he said, you manage these captives. I guess that Vaidy's trade caravan will be here soon. When the time comes, sell these captives to them and buy more food and tools. Understood. Manit nodded. He was a merchant, so it was an easy job for him. Kant then said to Firentis, you should also go and do your work. Arrange the sentries and patrols to ensure the safety of the Oasis lookout. Yes, sir, Firentis replied. After all the basic arrangements were done, Kant nodded and walked towards other places. He intended to inspect his own estate. After all, he wanted to take a good look after leveled up the place. Arriving at the east gate, Kant walked around the city wall. He was observing his own estate. There was still a lot of empty lands in the entire Oasis lookout. These lands were reserved for future construction. Because the funds were not enough, these lands could only be used as an open warehouse to store miscellaneous items. There were 200 peasant workers busy with their works. However, the number of civilians in the current fortress was still very small. Many tasks could not be carried out for the time being. For example, harvesting of the Chi grass required a lot of civilians. In addition, feeding the livestock with forage, processing the forage, and leveling the land required a lot of manpower. We're still short of people. Kant sighed deeply. The special effect of a house could recruit civilians, but this special effect could only be activated when there was a shortage of people and extra empty houses. Now that the houses were full of people, this special effect would not be activated at all. In order to increase the population, other than temporary system characters, they could only build more houses. Kant had long expected this. The entire area of Trondheim fortress was about half a hectare. And this was only the area inside the city wall. This was enough for the current construction of the estate to cover most of the buildings. After all the buildings were built, perhaps the inside of the city wall wouldn't be as empty as it was now, and it would become crowded. At the same time, this would also promote the next level up of Trondheim. At that time, it would become a real castle. The buildings inside the city wall would become the internal buildings, and it would be the core area for the castle to continue expanding. Oh, the trade caravan is here. Kant noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head and saw a trade caravan. The familiar leader of the trade caravan rode in front. 6 trade caravan guards followed him on their horseback. 12 sentries were guarding 5 carriages on foot. They were from Vaidyr, just like the configuration of the trade caravan when they first arrived. Chapter 102, The Return of the Trade Caravan. The Vaidyr caravan, which had departed for 3 weeks, had finally returned on the first day of the month. The strong horse was breathing heavily as it pulled the rope. It drove the wide and thick wheels with nails over the sand, leaving deep marks. It was obvious that the carriage was full of goods, and they had prepared all the goods for the trade. Guarding the city gate was a team of Swadean footmen. After carefully inspecting the carriage and making sure that there were no abnormalities, they waved their hands and let it pass. Although they knew each other, they were still extremely cautious of these Vaidyr's people. This was the habitual thinking of the continent of Karadia, so the leader of the trade caravan was not surprised. They received the same treatments when they passed by the various castles and towns of the Kingdom of Swadia. After all, the Kingdom of Swadia was an enemy country. They led the trade caravan to the council hall. The leader of the trade caravan turned around his head to look at the new buildings around him, with a surprised expression on his face. It could really be said that things had completely changed. Before he left, he still remembered that the Oasis lookout was a small and simple village. However, 3 weeks had passed in a blink of an eye. When he returned to this place, he found that it had actually become a fortress that had just taken shape. The stone city walls and city gates were firm and sturdy. They were guarded by the light footmen on duty. The internal buildings were clean and tidy. The planning was reasonable. That is, the leader of the trade caravan glanced at the empty space beside the eastern city gate. Finalizing was assigning the mission. The heavily and fully armed Swadean soldiers lined up neatly and waited for orders. There were 46 Swadean heavy cavalry soldiers and 50 Swadean footmen. Although there were less than 100 of them, the guards and sentries of the trade caravan were shocked by this scene. They appeared to be frightened by the soldiers and couldn't help but shrink their heads. These were the true elites that been through hundreds of battles, a powerful force that could break through the enemy's formation. At the same time, they also discovered the 40 desert bandits on the training ground. The desert bandits who were watching over the captives were also staring at the trade caravan. Many of them even raised their scimitars and revealed sinister smiles. Profession habits were not so easy to change. This made the trade caravan even more nervous. As for these ruthless bandits who were infamous in the Sarrand desert, the 12 guards of the trade caravan subconsciously grabbed their spears tightly. Their actual combat strength was not much better than the recruits, but facing so many desert bandits, even if they resisted desperately, they would not be able to live for long. The desert bandits here were at the same level as those bandits in the snowy plains of Vaidyr. The trade caravan had traveled across the north and the south. Although they never met these bandits because of luck, they always heard of the unfortunate incidents of others in the tavern. It was considered lucky if only their belongings were stolen by the desert bandits. If their water was snatched as well, it would be truly miserable. Everyone, get your spirits up. The leader of the trade caravan in front of snorted coldly. He, who had once served as a knight in the kingdom of Vaidyr, had the guts and courage. However, when he saw his cowardly caravan members, he could not help but scold them in a low voice. This is Lord Kant's estate. They are Lord Kant's cavalry. Ah, yes. Hearing these words, the guards and sentries of the trade caravan came back to their senses. However, being stared by the malicious gazes of those desert bandits, their hearts were still pounding. It was still made them afraid despite their glories and courage in their fighting days. The leader of the trade caravan could only sigh to himself. He felt lucky that he had not been robbed by bandits in the past. However, the sigh in his heart did not come out. He led his warhorse forward quickly and looked at the figure standing in front of the council hall. He hurriedly bowed and said in a very respectful tone, "Respected Lord Kant, it is an honor to see you again." "I am also happy to see you," Kant replied with a smile. He had a good impression of the leader of the trade caravan who could stand up and choose to fight during the crisis of the estate. Therefore, he asked in a more amiable tone, "What did you bring this time?" "It's a lot of food." The leader of the trade caravan immediately replied, "There are also various tools, oil in the urn, and tons of linen. These are all the materials you need now. I didn't bring the other luxury wines. This is indeed what I need the most." Kant nodded and smiled. "That's great." The leader of the trade caravan happily lowered his head, appearing even more respectful. Kant smiled and said, "Come in. Let them do these small little things." At the same time, Kant turned to the guard beside him and said, "Go and find Manad. I think they will have a common topic to talk about." "Understood." The Swadian footman, who was served as a guard, received the order and leave in fast paces. "Manad?" The genius merchant from Nord's territory, the leader of the trade caravan, was slightly stunned. Kant smiled and asked, "You've heard of him?" The leader of the trade caravan revealed a bitter smile. "Yes, Manad is the model of our trade caravan. During the war between the kingdom of Vaidyr and the Kyrgyz Khanate, he provided supplies to both sides. He made the terrifying amount of profit and the news spread throughout the entire continent." "Oh!" Kant raised his eyebrows slightly. The strategy of selling supplies to both sides of the war seemed a little familiar. Shaking his head, Kant didn't think too much and said to the leader of the trade caravan, "If you're done with the trade caravan, then come in. I still want to discuss the purchase of food with you." "Yes, Lord." The leader of the trade caravan watched Kant walk into the council hall. At the same time, he hurriedly waved his hand, telling the trade caravan behind him to move quickly. As an excellent leader of the trade caravan, he understood that he shouldn't let the Lord wait for too long. Otherwise, it would be a serious breach of etiquette, and the relationship that he had painstakingly built with Kant would become loose. Fortunately, the grocery store wasn't far away. The leader of the trade caravan brought his men over and carried all the goods down. They placed them neatly on the empty counters and shelves. It seemed that he came prepared well. Soon, the trade caravan resumed its business. Kant returned to the council hall. Food. He was sitting on the chair and tapped his fingers on the table. Food was the problem that he needed to solve as soon as possible. It couldn't take long. Although the Oasis lookout had a lot of stored food. But it was going to be an issue anyway. The current Oasis lookout had a rapid increase in the number of people, and the consumption of food was also rising day by day. In particular, the consumption of food by the troops was even more terrifying. All soldiers were gluttonous because they need more strength to carry tons of heavy works. Even the warhorse they rode on also needed to feed bread and grains constantly to replenish the nutrients that lack in the Chi grass. The most crucial thing was definitely the expedition army of the Kingdom of Grey Mane. If these high-level Jack Allen really crossed the Narran Desert and reached here, the Oasis lookout would definitely be surrounded by enemies. After entering a stalemate, Kant and the others would be able to defend with full confidence. With sufficient food and water, as long as Kant did not act foolishly and the troops did not slack off, no matter how the Jack Allen attacked, with his loyal elite troops, they would be able to defend this fortress. It was just like what happened on a small island in the eastern Mediterranean in the 16th century. Less than 200 hospital knights guarded a small castle on an island and forcefully withstood the frenzied attack of 20,000 Ottoman Empire troops. Although this had a lot to do with the geographical advantage, when the Ottoman Empire troops finally chose to besiege the hospital knights didn't afraid at all, and they had sufficient food and water. They still defended for several years and became a sharp nail for the European forces in the eastern Mediterranean. This was a battle in history that Kant had once understood, and it was a living example. The supply line of the Kingdom of Grey Mane would be stretched very long if they want to cross the desert. This supply line might even on the verge of collapse. They could only replenish their resources by plundering the territory of the human kingdom. Therefore, Kant chose to defend to the death, just like blocking the thought of plundering by the expedition army of the Kingdom of Grey Mane. Strengthen the defense and hide the goods, wait at ease for the exhausted enemies. This tactic was used a lot by the old Chinese ancestors. Back then, the Han dynasty's Ban Chao had relied on this tactic to lead the various countries in the western region. Then, he sent the light cavalry to harass and intercept the supply lines of the expedition army of the Kushan Empire, easily won a victory. This was a historically accurate and correct tactic. As for these high-level Jack Allen, Kant didn't think that their supply line would be strong enough to supply their expeditionary army to cross the entire Narran Desert. If that was really the case, then the so-called Kingdom of Grey Mane, they won't be threatened by the lizardmen and the elves and came over here to develop. While he was thinking, the wooden door of the council hall was opened, and Manad walked in. At the same time, the leader of the trade caravan of Rivadin also came in. Lord Kant. The two bowed respectfully to Kant. Yes, Kant didn't mind their politeness, he nodded and reached out his hand. Sit down. Thank you for your kindness. After the two thanked him, they sat on both sides of the bench. The peasant, who was also a servant, came over with breakfast and gave them a portion of the bench. It was made up of toast, dried meat, dried sausage, boiled gazelle meat, and cabbage soup. It was still the same as before, except for the fresh gazelle meat and a plate of fine white salt. It was only breakfast time. The trade caravan leader had not eaten yet due to rushing. When he saw his portion, he quickly stood up and bowed respectfully. Thank you for your generosity, Lord Kant. It's fine, I just prepared some extra. Kant smiled and shook his head. The three of them quickly ate breakfast and chatted about the interesting things they knew. However, most of the time, it was Manad and the leader of the trade caravan were talking. Kant was eating while listening. He related the content of the game that he played before with their chat. He could not help but smile when he heard some funny passages. Chapter 103, Jiya's Quest. Occasionally, Kant would interrupt and say something that he knew about the background of the game, which attracted the admiration of the two of them. This made the breakfast very harmonious, at least there was not a bit unpleasant. They were all people from the system, so Kant could be relaxed, at least there was no need for scheming. In their happy conversation, they finished their breakfast. The long-prepared servants came over to clean up the tableware. At the same time, they quickly wiped the long table with 2 dry and wet towels. The table was cleaned and tidy. The leader of the trade caravan became serious. He knew it was time to talk about some serious matters. "How was breakfast, do you like it?" Kant wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and asked casually. "It's delicious," the leader of the trade caravan answered immediately. At the same time, he said happily, "Especially the gazelle meat. The taste is very fresh. The sand gazelle that was killed not long ago." Kant nodded with a smile and said with a hint of helplessness, "This may be one of the few benefits in the desert. As long as the meat is hung in a dark place to dry, it is easy to preserve the meat. Unlike other places, if it is not well preserved, it will rot." "No wonder," the leader of the trade caravan replied. Manad, who was beside him, asked with a smile, "Then do you accept this gazelle meat?" Kant also looked at the leader of the trade caravan. In fact, this was what he wanted to ask. If the trade caravan, as a system merchant, accepted the gazelle meat, Kant and others could mass hunt the sand gazelles that migrated across the Sinway range every month. They could turn these little fluffy cuties into dinars. However, Kant and Manad's plans were clearly failed. The leader of the trade caravan said hesitantly, "Lord Kant, we don't simply accept everything." This was a tactful refusal. Kant was not mad. This was the rule of the system and had nothing to do with the leader of the trade caravan. After pondering for a moment, Kant put down the handkerchief in his hand and looked at the leader of the trade caravan. He asked, "Then what can you buy?" "If possible, I will try my best to get my men to prepare it. This way, we can form long-term cooperation." Since the leader of the trade caravan said that he wouldn't buy everything, it also meant that were some things that he could buy. "Yes." The leader of the trade caravan nodded and replied, "Like the jack-allans from before, they are very popular in the kingdom of Vaidyrs." "Slave trade," Manad added on the side. The leader of the trade caravan didn't beat around the bush, instead, he said straight away, "The kingdom of Vaidyrs is rich in iron ore, and beneath the vast snowy plains by the Kudun River, there are countless iron ores. These are the precious resources of our kingdom of Vaidyrs. As long as we can mine more iron ores, we will be able to earn more dinar." "Oh, that sounds good," Kant nodded. He obviously knew this. After all, Kudun was a famous location for trading. The iron ore produced in this city and its village could be sold for 2 to 3 times the price in other cities. In Wercheg, a place where the iron ore was extremely lacked, it could even be sold for 10 times the price. The leader of the trade caravan also added, "Because the iron ore in the snowfield is difficult to mine, digging a mine in the snow and permafrost is also a threat to the miners' lives. Therefore, a large number of slaves are needed to be recruited every year." The owners of the iron ore mine express their admiration for the strong and durable jack-allan. They believe that this stupid race can be the best slave miners, so they will spend a large amount of dinar to buy these slaves. They are very popular commodities. Indeed. As a former leader of a large-scale trade caravan, Manad nodded and said to Kant, "Every year, the kingdom of Vaidyrs buys a large number of slaves, but apart from the war years, there are not many slaves to buy. But this is very good." Kant nodded with a smile. He did not care about what would happen to the jack-allan. He only cared about the dinar that he could obtain. With a slight shrug, Kant said to the leader of the trade caravan, "We have recently captured another 120 jack-allan captives, and I plan to have a hunt to capture more jack-allan soon. I hope you have enough dinar to buy." "Of course, I brought enough money this time." The leader of the trade caravan nodded. At this point, he seemed to have remembered something. He took out a letter from his pocket and respectfully placed it on the table. He said to Kant, "King Yarajek of the kingdom of Vaidyrs has this to entrusted me, an expression of his sincere respect to you." Kant was slightly stunned as he stared at the letter. As the ruler of the snowy plains at the beginning of the game, the King Yarajek of the kingdom of Vaidyrs was very well known. Now, the king sent a letter to him. Manad was good at reading people's thoughts. He immediately picked up the envelope on the table and placed it in front of Kant. At the same time, he said softly, "The people of Vaidyr are very forthright. It should be a letter to express their greetings to you." "Is that so?" Kant picked up the envelope and gently tore it open. He could understand the letter written in the Vaidyr language. The paragraph was not long, so it was indeed a greeting. Moreover, in Kant's eyes, these greetings were very respectful. This king of the Vaidyrs had completely placed himself in a weak position. Even the final discussion seemed to be a request. When Kant finished reading the letter, a dialog box popped up on his screen. Ding, special quest issued. Special quest, the quest of the Kingdom of Vaidyrs. Reward, honor ×5. Introduction, the snowy plains of the Kingdom of Vaidyrs are rich in iron ore. This is the main source of revenue for their national treasury. However, due to the geological structure, mining iron ore was undoubtedly a difficult problem. The king of Vaidyrs promised that if you could send 500 Jack Allen slaves, then you would gain the friendship of the Kingdom of Vaidyrs. Kant quickly glanced at the mission dialog box. He raised his eyebrows slightly. It was a special quest that he had not encountered for a long time. 500 Jack Allen slaves, Kant's tongue brushed past his lips, and a smile appeared on his face. He nodded to the leader of the trade caravan and said, "Go back and tell King Yarajek that I am very happy to solve the problem of the scarcity of miners for him." "You are the most generous." The leader of the trade caravan stood up and bowed respectfully. "Of course." Kant smiled. How could he give up the 5 honor points? This meant he could randomly draw the rich rewards in the system mall 5 times. Not to mention he had the plan to gather troops and conduct a large-scale capture of slaves so that the defeated Jack Allen would completely lose the ability to contend with Kant. Otherwise, when the expedition army of the Kingdom of Greymane arrived, these low-level Jack Allen might be gathered by them again. "Right." Manad spoke at this moment. He took a plate of fine white salt from the table and placed it in front of the leader of the trade caravan. He asked, "This is high-grade salt. Don't you know that the Kingdom of Vaidyrs needs this?" Kant also looked at the trade caravan leader. "Oh." The trade caravan leader's face showed embarrassment and hesitation. "Don't you need this kind of goods?" Kant was a little curious. Although Vaidyrs was close to the sea and had its own coastline, it didn't have the skills to boil salt or dry salt. They usually bought the salt from the Nords of Wurcheg, who had mastered the skills to boil salt. Logically speaking, these Vaidyrs definitely needed salt. Manad also frowned slightly. He obviously did not expect that the leader of the trade caravan would give up the idea of buying table salt. "Sorry, my lord." The leader of the trade caravan looked very ashamed and guilty. He said to Kant, "We cannot buy things that are not produced by your territory, Trondheim, because this is the land of miracles." "Land of miracles," Kant said with a strange look. However, looking at the leader of the trade caravan's guilty look, he nodded and said, "It's okay." It was probably the request of the system. According to Kant's understanding of the system, this could mean that an item that did not come from the system could not be exchanged for dinar. Kant knew about this before. He initially thought that the system would allow hard work trade and perhaps let go of this rule. But he didn't expect it still to be the same. The leader of the trade caravan also put down the plate of fine white salt regretfully. He said to Kant, "As far as I know, the goods that can be brought back from the land of miracles, other than the items produced by your estate and the Jack Allen slaves, only gold and rare items can be brought back. And these 2 items can bring you a rich reward." Kant was slightly stunned and soon caught the keywords in the words of the leader of the trade caravan. Gold and rare items. Kant raised his eyebrows. In this world, the prices of these 2 items were a bit high. Gold basically was not something that a peasant can acquire. It was a currency that circulated between noble families. Moreover, it was a special material that mages used to cast spells. Its value was equal to 1 gold coin, which could be exchanged for 80 great silver coins. It was difficult for ordinary merchants to accept it. Even the smaller noble families probably did not have many gold coins. As for rare items, they were even more precious. Gold could at least be bought if one had money, but rare items that possessed extraordinary powers were not something that could be bought just because one wanted to. The owners have all kept it as a treasure of their families. Unless their families were at risk, they would not take out these rare items. When Kant was studying in the academy, he had read about them in books. However, Kant reached out his hand and knocked on the table. He just happened to have a few rare items. For example, intimidation, page of fertile soil, page of clear spring, and sun disk were all rare items that Kant had obtained and indirectly returned by the system. Among them, intimidation and sun disk were the most useful. One was a war artifact, and the other was installed at the top of the sentry tower. It cooled down the temperature of the sun during the day and increased the temperature at night, making Kant sleep quite comfortably at night. As for page of fertile soil and page of clear spring, these two thin pieces of paper, Kant didn't know what to do with them. "Come here, I have something I need you to do." Narrowing his eyes, Kant turned his head and beckoned to the servant beside him, "Go to my room and take my box. It's in the cupboard." "Understood," the servant nodded and immediately walked over. Soon, he took down a simple wooden box and placed it on the table in front of Kant. "My lord, this is it," then he left politely. Chapter 104, A Rare Item of High Value. The leader of the trade caravan looked at the ordinary wooden box with a puzzled expression. Manad also looked at it. "This is a rare item." Kant shrugged and said, he pulled no punches. Since they were all in this together, he opened the wooden box. The bottom of the box was made of exquisite smooth velvet cloth and two pieces of paper with mysterious runes written on them were placed on it. They emitted mysterious energy and seemed to be very enchanting. They were the page of fertile soil and the page of clear spring that Kant had obtained from the Jack Allen shaman. "Help me estimate the price. How many dinars would these two rare items be worth?" Kant pushed the open wooden box forward. "Yes, my lord." The leader of the trade caravan immediately stood up and respectfully walked toward Kant. He lifted the wooden box with both his hands and cautiously looked at the two rare items that seemed to be pages from a book. There was a gleam in his eyes, but his expression became extremely solemn. Kant and Manad looked at each other. It seemed that the trade caravan leader valued this kind of strange object very much. It was indeed the case. The leader of the trade caravan sighed and said to Kant, "My lord, if I were to estimate the price, these two rare objects would be worth more than 20,000 dinars." He paused for a moment and continued, "If it can be sold in Rivadin where many nobles who have some money to spare would raise the price would even increase by another 10,000 dinars. Kant raised his eyebrows. 30,000 dinars. Manad, who was sitting next to him, also looked at Kant. It was obvious that the price of these two pages had also exceeded his expectations. They were only two pieces of paper. The price was already so shockingly high. In comparison, on the continent of Karadia, the 30,000 dinars could be used to open the most expensive dye factory in any city to produce velvet cloth. 3 dye factories, to be exact. If he directly sold them to the leader of the trade caravan in front of him, he could obtain 20,000 dinars in the shortest amount of time possible. Kant had broken his previous record in earning dinars. Kant had been living in this world for 16 years. And the total amount of money he had earned after all these years was probably this much. And the two pieces of paper could easily be sold for that amount of money. He could not help but shake his head and smile bitterly. "This really surprises me," Kant sighed softly. "My lord." However, the leader of the trade caravan spoke with a hint of tactful dissuasion, "If it is possible, I do not think that selling these rare items is the way to go. After all, they are unique and contain mysterious power, they might come in handy someday." Kant frowned and looked at the two rare items in the wooden box. "Come in handy?" "Yes, the leader of the trade caravan nodded solemnly. Kant, on the other hand, had some doubts. He raised his head to look at the man and asked, "I don't quite understand. Can you elaborate?" The leader of the trade caravan who was deployed by the system definitely knew something. Perhaps this was also a hint given by the system. Although Kant did not understand, he would not let his so-called identity hold him back from asking. If you don't understand something, just ask. Simple as that. The leader of the trade caravan lowered his head slightly and said apologetically, "My lord, this kind of rare items are not something I am familiar with." Hey? Kant frowned. He reached his hand out and took the two rare items out from the wooden box. The mysterious runes on them seemed to be conveying a secret from ancient times. However, Kant had never studied these runes before. His was not as good as those scholars in the academy when it comes to ancient history. Thinking about this, Kant could not help but smile bitterly. If Scholar Hank was here, perhaps he could give him some leads. But even without Scholar Hank, Kant still had his system at his disposal. As his river of thoughts started flowing, the information about the 2 pages popped up on his eye's retina. Page of fertile soil, incomplete. This piece of paper with mysterious symbols on it seems to be an incomplete page that was torn from a certain book. However, it still possessed mysterious power and could communicate with the mysterious plane of the earth element. Every 7 days, it could summon a small group, 5 to 10, of earth elemental giants. Remark: since the page is incomplete, the summoned creature cannot be controlled. The summoned creatures are most likely hostile. Page of clear spring, incomplete. This piece of paper with mysterious symbols on it seems to be a page torn from a book. However, it still possessed mysterious power and could communicate with the mysterious plane of water element. Every 7 days, it could summon a small group, 5 to 10, of water elemental giants. Remark: since the page is incomplete, the summoned creatures cannot be controlled. The summoned creatures are most likely hostile. This was the detailed data on the 2 rare items. It was the system's analysis of the rules. The introduction was very clear. Kant's eyes narrowed. He seemed to be deep in thought. "I see." Kant raised his head and looked at the leader of the trade caravan. He asked in a deep voice, "When you mentioned that they would come in handy, they must be the elemental giants that can be summoned every week with these 2 pages." Perhaps so. The leader of the trade caravan lowered his head. He was not certain. But, to Kant, it was no different from an affirmative answer. The system's merchant might not be able to reveal the whole structure directly, but with the guidance of certain words, what they said were just like hints from the system. Kant was not a fool, he could understand the meaning behind it. What these 2 pages could do was to summon the water elemental giants and the earth elemental giants. Kant was not surprised. This kind of magical object was quite common in the games, literature, movies, and other works in his previous life. And in this world, Kant, who studied in the academy, also learned about this kind of stuff in some books about mages. Although he was not able to go deep into the topic because he did not have enough background knowledge, at least he knew what it was. His gaze continued to sweep across the dialogue box on his retina. Kant carefully read the introduction of the 2 rare objects. In the end, he made sure that he did not miss or misunderstand anything. Kant closed the dialogue box and directly instructed Manad, "Go and inform Firentis. Gather 30 Swadian infantrymen and 20 Ravenstern rangers outside the east gate. Get ready for battle." "Understood." Manad immediately stood up and nodded. He bowed to Kant and quickly left. At present, the situation in the Oasis lookout changed with thunder-like violence and wind-like swiftness all the time. Kant also stood up and smiled at the leader of the trade caravan who was still waiting. "If there's nothing else, let's go and take a look together." This might be the first time that things like elemental giants appeared on the continent of Caradia. Their names sounded strange to me. The leader of the trade caravan bowed respectfully, and he said with gratitude, "It's my honor, my lord." Kant chuckled, Let's go. The garrisons in the Oasis lookout had always been loose on the outside, but tight on the inside. As Cant gave the order, Finalizing immediately gathered his troops, and they began to assemble. 30 Swadian infantrymen and 20 Ravenstern rangers were all present. To ensure the town's safety, Finalizing also deployed 41 Swadian infantrymen as patrols and 20 desert bandits as reinforcements. Even the 46 Swadian heavy cavalrymen were in formation on the open ground not far from the east gate. Since moving the 20 Ravenstern rangers who were keeping a lookout and observing on the top floor of the council hall might cause them to lose control of the surrounding situation, Finalizing could only let part of the Swadian infantry be in charge of standing guard. If it was not the case, Finalizing almost wanted to gather all the troops that the current Oasis lookout had. All of this was done for the sake of Cant's safety. After all, Cant was the lord whom they respected the most. Nothing could go wrong. Soon, Cant came over from the council hall. The leader of the trade caravan accompanied him, Manad and Finalizing also went over. Lord Cant, the troops are assembled. Finalizing answered very solemnly. Yes, very good. Cant nodded. Turning his head to look at the stairs at the city wall, he walked over and took the stairs to reach the top of the 6-meter-tall city gate. Compared to the 5-meter-tall stone city wall, it was clear that he was more satisfied with the thick stone city gate in terms of both width and sturdiness. It was necessary to be cautious when facing the elemental giants. Lord, shall we begin? Finalizing asked. Wait. Cant shook his head and pointed at the troops that were already lined up below. He instructed Finalizing, have the Ravenstern Rangers stand guard on the city wall. All infantrymen stand by the inner gate. Move the cavalry behind the dune, they will attack at any time. Upon hearing the series of orders, Finalizing was stunned. He could not help but say, we will not have any defense on the outside of the city wall. Without the position on the outside of the city wall would be exposed to the enemy's attack range. If this was a desperate battle, it might not matter. But now, Lord Cant was still waiting on the city gate. If the enemy attacked the city wall or even appeared above the city wall, the Lord would be in danger. It was unacceptable to Finalizing. Manad and the leader of the trade caravan also advised, Lord Cant, this is indeed very dangerous. This can't be considered dangerous. Cant was calm, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile, they are only elemental giants of the lowest level. Cant turned his head and chuckled, the knowledge he gained from the academy gave him confidence, don't worry. These elemental giants cannot be called true giants. If these low-level fellows can break through the city walls, we might as well give up the Oasis lookout and return to the dukedom of Leo and let the noble take care of us. Then, Lord Cant, please remain vigilant. Seeing his reaction, Finalizing nodded and did not try to dissuade them. He waved his hand and ordered the troops to follow the orders. However, to ensure Cant's safety, Finalizing still gathered 10 Swadian infantrymen and held a thick fan-shaped shield to guard the city gate. If any unexpected accidents happened, there would be time to react. And the troops were all ready. Chapter 105, The Elemental Giant Killed. Everyone was ready. 20 Ravenstern Rangers walked up to the top of the city wall, holding white heavy bows in their hands. They pulled out cone-shaped arrows from their quivers and knocked them on their bowstrings. 30 Swadian infantrymen and 41 Swadian light infantrymen also entered through the city gate. They gawked at the heavy wooden gate. As soon as an order was given, they could charge out of the city gate to fight. The 20 desert bandits had already moved behind the dune. As soon as orders came from the city gate, they would charge with their horses and pylons or use their short javelins to disrupt the enemy's formations, these were their specialties. Furthermore, 46 Swadian heavy cavalrymen were quietly waiting at the open space beside the city gate. If something the other troops could not handle happened, they and their horses would appear on the battlefield. They were the cruiser tanks. They would crush any enemy like a great flood. Very good. Cant praised them in his heart. That was a reliable elite troop. His mind was about to communicate with the system, but the system contacted him first. Ding. Temporary side quest issued. Temporary side quest 1, kill all the earth elemental giants. Temporary side quest 2, kill all the water elemental giants. Reward 1, Grouse's nest times 5. Reward 2, desert bee's nest times 10. Reward, additional spring returns, all the date palm tree enters the flowering stage. Introduction, you are ready to use these rare items, but a mysterious force that tells you that the elemental giants summoned by them are not under your control. But fortunately, you can kill them and let them know what you rely on. The system dialog box popped up on his retina. This was a temporary side quest from the system, but Kant glanced at it and frowned. 2 side quests. 3 rewards. Kant had never encountered this kind of task before. But it's fine. Slowly letting out a breath, Kant's expression hardened. Since the system had already issued him a side quest, he would just do it. It was just a battle. Even in the introduction, the system had hinted that these elemental giants could be killed by his troops. This made Kant feel even more confident. Then I'll start with you. Kant exhaled gently, communicating with the system in his mind. He held the page of fertile soil in his hand. As the system connected with his mind, he was sort of enlightened. Although he still did not understand the reason behind it, Kant had a feeling that he was born with the power. He said softly, "Summon the earth elemental giants." A mysterious connection instantly formed. Through the rare object in his hand, the mysterious energy was suddenly released violently. Hum. Space was seemingly trembling, a certain soft sound was heard. On the top of the city wall, the 20 Ravenstern Rangers who were ready for the battle suddenly drew the heavy bow in their hands into the shape of a full moon. They were master archers who honed their superb archery skills in the misty mountains. The cone-shaped arrows were aimed at the sandy ground in front of them. Their faces were extremely grave, and there was even a hint of astonishment in the depths of their eyes. It wasn't just them. Even the Swadian heavy cavalrymen on the city gate, the leaders of the trade caravan, as well as Firentus and Manad, were also filled with astonishment. Kant, who had already mentally prepared himself, was also surprised. In an area about 30 meters away from the city wall, ripples that looked like water waves appeared on the surface of the sandy ground that Kant had been looking at, and the sand grains and mud began to rise and condense in an extremely short time. In just 3 to 5 seconds. 7 humanoid creatures that were nearly 2.5 meters tall and covered in mud appeared in front of them. 2 dim yellow lights were flickering in the area that seemed to be ahead. They were just like eyes. When they saw Kant and the others on the city wall, muffled roars were heard. They stepped forward, raised their huge hands that were completely made of mud, and stomped toward Kant. Their bodies seemed to be very heavy. Their feet sank into the sand with every step they took, but they did not care at all as they moved forward, approaching the city wall at a rather fast speed. The 7 earth elemental giants were like fearless berserkers. Kant narrowed his eyes. The earth elemental giants that were once recorded in the books were indeed so ugly, just like mud sculptures of the worst quality. However, because of their elemental bodies, they were as strong as 2 adults together. They did not fear death. It was because these earth elemental giants were magical creatures born from the plane of the earth element. They were something between living things and matter. To them, death was just returning to their original state. However, their brute strength and the fact that they did not have a body of flesh and blood nor any obvious vital points would give any enemy a hard time. On the battlefield, these earth elemental giants were like some powerful infantries who did not know fatigue. They would kill until they fall. Rumor has it that mages from certain schools had researched and constructed golems based on these elemental giants, and they were very powerful. Of course, Kant had only read about it in a book, and the author got the information from hearsay. The most critical problem Kant was facing now was how to deal with these 7 earth elemental giants who were menacing and were obviously hostile. What could he do to make them stop? Beside him, some burly figures moved forward. 10 Swadian infantrymen were holding their shields, standing shoulder to shoulder. The long swords that were meticulously made by blacksmiths had already been drawn from their sheaths. They were fearless in the face of danger. Finalizing had also recovered from his initial shock. He pulled out his knight's sword and said solemnly, "My lord, these monsters are definitely not friendly. Do you wish to give the order to attack?" Kant nodded and said without hesitation, "Open fire! Open fire!" When Finalizing heard Kant's order, he immediately turned his head and ordered the Ravenstern Rangers who were already in position on the city wall. When the earth elemental giant appeared, they had already drawn their heavy bows into the shape of a full moon. Before the order could completely escape Finalizing's mouth, the Ravenstern Rangers, masters of archery skills, had already released the strings. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The cone-shaped arrows were moving at an extreme speed, the arrowheads easily tore through the air and flashed through space. The archery skills taught by the hunting barbarians in the Misty Mountains made these rangers the greatest master archers in Ravenstern with excellent eyesight, high accuracy, and fierce shooting. They targeted the faces of the earth elemental giants. To be more precise, they aimed at the spots where the 2 balls of shimmering yellow light that seemed to be their eyes were located. Bang! Broken pieces of mud were flying everywhere. The slender and sharp arrowhead pierced directly into the earth elemental giant's eyes that were shimmering with yellow light. The tails of the arrows buzzed while the arrowheads were buried deep inside their heads, and they seemed to have hit something because the 7 earth elemental giants, who were originally charging forward aggressively, instantly stopped moving and froze on the spot. The firing range was less than 10 meters, and that was nothing to these Ravenstern Rangers who were a Class 5 troop. However, at the top of the city gate, the Swadian infantrymen held the heavy fan shields in their hands and still did not dare move their feet. Looking at the earth elemental giants who were relatively close to them, they could even see that their bodies, which were made of soil, were still slightly green. It seemed to be a grass species that had sprouted and grown on these earth elemental giants. Soon after, the bodies of the 7 earth elemental giants began to tremble slightly. The cone-shaped arrows pierced deeply into their eye sockets on the blurry faces on their heads. The dim yellow light dispersed at a speed visible to the naked eye through the arrow shaft. The bodies of all the earth elemental giants trembled even more intensely now. In an instant, they collapsed into a large amount of soil. The entire earth elemental giant's 2.5 meters tall and broad body had turned into a pile of soil on the sandy ground outside the city wall. "Is it over?" Manat sounded somewhat doubtful. The leader of the trade caravan also mustered up his courage and took a few quick steps forward. When he arrived at the edge of the city gate, he looked at the 7 piles of soil not far away and gulped. Were they really all killed? He could not describe it with words. A human-shaped object made of a pile of soil was killed. What word could he use to describe it? Yes, they were indeed killed. Kant nodded. The earth elemental giants should be considered a different kind of life form. After all, death existed. However, he had carefully observed the battle. He turned his head and said to Finalizing, "It seems that the vital points of these earth elemental giants are not their bodies, but their eyes that are flashing with light. They are like the human heart and head." "That is indeed the case, my lord," Finalizing nodded. He also noticed that next comes the water elemental giants. Kant was calm. He was not proud of killing these 7 earth elemental giants. Putting down the page of fertile soil in his hand, Kant took out the page of clear spring. His mind was connected to the system. That mysterious power appeared in his mind once again. It was as if he had practiced it countless times. He said softly, "Summon the water elemental giants." Hum. As soon as he said that, a soft voice that seemed to tremble the space was again heard. It was still within Kant's line of sight. The grains of sand instantly became darker. This was because they were stained with water. And within the grains of sand, clear water rapidly emerged. Within an extremely short period, they rapidly took shape and turned into humanoid creatures that were more than 2 meters tall. Their entire bodies were as clear as water, with a faint blue color, and deep blue light was emitting from the structures that seemed to be their eyes on the heads. And that seemed to be the center of a water elemental giant. These 2 water elemental giants did not have legs. Below their waists, there was only water. They were equally aggressive and charged at Kant and his men at a high speed. It was as if they had a deep hatred for them. Only this time, the 2 of them did not go too far. The Ravenstern Rangers, who was already in position for a long time, immediately released the bowstrings. Following piercing screams, they kept away the heavy bows in their hands and looked in front of them indifferently. Water was splashing in all directions, the water droplets seeped into the sand and disappeared. Only some light blue fragments were left. Under the sunlight, they were flickering with beautiful blue light among the grains of sand. Chapter 106, Drop of Defective Gemstones. The arrow pierced straight into the eye socket. The entire arrow was fixed at its head, just like it was pierced into a soft jelly. The 2 water elemental giants' azure blue bodies began to tremble. Large circles of ripples began to spread within their bodies. Following the sound of splashing water, their bodies exploded in an instant, scattered in all directions. The extremely dry sand was nourished by the water, and the sand layer quickly pitted and turned to darker yellow color. As for the water elemental giants, they had completely disappeared. Only a few light blue fragments were left and fell in between the sand particles at the spot where their bodies collapsed. As the sunlight shone on them, they flickered with a beautiful blue light, but Kant and the others on the city gate did not notice it. Kant smiled slightly and said, "It seems very easy." After dealing with the 7 earth elemental giants, the Ravenstern Rangers had mastered the vital parts of these elemental giants. They were able to shoot without missing an arrow within a range of less than 30 meters, they were among the top archers. Their bowstrings trembled slightly, and the arrows shot into the giants' eyes that were shimmering with a faint light. These elemental giants were then completely annihilated and turned back to their basic elemental form. It was effortless for the level 5 troop class like the Ravenstern Rangers. At this moment, Kant thought that the weekly salary of 77 dinars per person was worthy. It looks like. Firentus frowned slightly and could not help but guess, these elemental giants should have similar strength as the Swadian footmen. Even though they don't have a body of flesh and blood, their combat ability can reach to the level of the Swadian sergeant. Swadian sergeant, Manad sounded a bit surprised. Yes, Firentus nodded. He understood why Manad sounded like this. Looking at the piles of soil and the splashing water in the sand at the outside of the city walls, he said solemnly, "But their own defense is extremely poor. To top-notch crossbow masters, these elemental giants are actually no different from the most ordinary unarmed civilians. It seems that getting rid of these things is very simple." The leader of the trade caravan swallowed his saliva and sighed. The use of word simple was understated. To the Ravenstern Rangers, it was simply no different from their usual training. Drawing arrows and shooting arrows, the enemy was killed in one go. As the leader of the trade caravan who came from the kingdom of Vaidyrs, he turned his head to look at the Ravenstern Rangers who were adjusting the bowstrings. The Rangers seemed very calm and relaxed, but his heart was rising with waves. These Rangers gave him the feeling that they were similar to Vaidyrs marksmen, those archery masters who were 1 in 100. However, they were different from the Vaidyrs marksmen who wore leather armor and light clothing with long bows in hand. The Ravenstern Rangers wore mail armor that looked like light footmen. They wore linen robes, and there was a fine 2-handed great sword in the scabbard on their backs. The white heavy composite bow was used as shooting bow, and it was placed in the bow pouch on their waists. It was obvious that when the enemy got close, these rangers with excellent archery skills could also pull out the 2-handed great swords on their backs, turning into experts in foot combat. They could deal fatal long-range damage, and they could also engage in close combat. The leader of the trade caravan felt that the sharpshooters of the kingdom of Vaidyrs were at a disadvantage. After all, they still needed the protection of the Vaidyr's soldiers who held two-handed battle axes. They are archers from the Misty Mountains. Kant turned his head and sensed the shock of the leader of the trade caravan. He explained with a smile, the Misty Mountain is a dense primitive forest. Sometimes, they need to face the enemy at close range, so they need to train their close combat skills. What an amazing warrior, the leader of the trade caravan nodded, he still amazed. Kant did not explain too much. Ravenstern marksman was indeed a master archer, they were level 5 troop class that were as good as a Vaidyr's marksman. However, in reality, both sides had their own advantages. For example, their shooting range and shooting habits were different. This also had to take into account the military requirements between countries. Vaidyr's marksmen specialized in large-scale rain of arrows. They used the army-to-army tactics to carry out archery training. As for the Ravenstern Rangers, they needed to defend against the barbarians in the Misty Mountains. They needed to fight in the primitive jungle. Therefore, moving in small troops and their accurate shooting, as well as their equally strong close combat, came in handy to defeat their enemies. Neither side was stronger or weaker. Both sides adapted the tactics that suitable for themselves. Ding, after your hard fighting, the enemy has been killed. Side Quest 1, kill all the Earth Elemental Giants completed. Side Quest 2, kill all the Water Elemental Giants completed. Reward 1, Sand Grouse Nest ×5. Reward 2, Desert Bee Nest ×10. Reward, additional, Spring, Date Palm Tree has all entered the flowering stage. Introduction, you have successfully summoned the Elemental Giants. That unique life form made you confused and shocked. However, when you mustered your courage and gave the order to kill them, these seemingly powerful Elemental Giants were actually vulnerable to your army. System prompt appeared. On Kant's screen, the temporary side quest had been announced to be over. 3 cards floated in his mind. They were the reward for this quest. However, Kant had yet to examine them carefully. The sound of galloping horses could be heard. The desert bandits, who had been hiding behind the dune waiting for orders. They seen the elemental giants had all been easily killed by the Ravenstern Ranger with their own eyes. Once the problem solved, they could only rush back on their horses. Whoosh! They came to the tightly shut city gate and tightened the reins to slow down the speed of the war horses. However, one of the bandits in the front was stunned. He instinctively tightened the reins to stop the desert horse from advancing. He turned his head to look at the sand layer at the edge of the city wall and said, "There seems like something over there." What? The other desert bandits also turned their heads to look. As the desert bandits, their eyesight was good. In the sand pit which stained with water, there was a light blue item in the middle of the pit. As the sunlight shone on it, the light blue item was crystal clear, and the name of the item to instantly appear in their minds. Gem. Many desert bandits cried out in surprise. On the city wall, the people who had not yet left also cast their gazes on them. Immediately, a ranger with better eyesight noticed that the water elemental giant had been killed. In the sand layer where its body had turned into water, there was actually a crystal clear blue gem-like item. Some desert bandits immediately dismounted and quickly walked over to pick it up. At the same time, they looked for the sand pit next to them and also found a light blue gemstone-like object. The city gate opened. The desert bandits entered the fortress. The leader offered these gemstones to Kant. "My lord, these are the gemstones dropped by the elemental giants. I really didn't expect that even after living in the Sarrand desert for so many years, I have never seen such an exquisite item." Gemstones, Kant reached out and took them. Firentus, Manad, and the leader of the trade caravan were all gathered at the side. Manad's expression was still fine, while the other two looked surprised at the light blue gemstone in Kant's hand. Clearly, even they had never seen such an exquisite item. After all, the continent of Karadia did not produce gemstones. Small number of gemstones were only obtained from Nord merchants who were able to trade across oceans. These were dropped after the water elemental giant was killed, Kant asked in a serious tone. The desert bandits nodded and said, yes, these 2 gemstones were obtained from the sand pit formed after the water elemental giant was killed. My guess is, they were definitely dropped after the giants being killed. However, Kant frowned slightly and turned his head thoughtfully. Could it be? There are similar gems among the earth elemental giants, the desert bandit immediately answered. Go and look, Kant ordered in a low voice. The desert bandits immediately nodded. Yes, Lord, they turned around and walked out of the city gate quickly. But this time, he came to the 7 piles of soil. The pile of soil was about half a meter high and had a slight fragrance after the rain. He could even vaguely see tiny stones and many grass seeds inside. The desert bandits took out their scimitars and started to dig at the pile of soil. Could it be that the vital points of these elemental giants are actually these gems? Phirantus swallowed his saliva secretly. Looking at the pale blue gem in Kant's hand, his sharp eyes noticed that a crack on it. He could not help but think of the blue light that quickly fainted when the arrow hit the water elemental giant. Manad nodded, that is definitely the case. It was easy to guess. Looking at the cracks of the crystal clear gemstones, it was obvious that it was formed from the impact of a sharp object. In fact, this was caused by the arrow. His guess was quickly confirmed. The desert bandits outside quickly returned. Lord, there are indeed 7 gemstones. The desert bandits held the 7 pale yellow gemstones in both hands. There were also cracks on the 7 gemstones caused by the heavy struck. Combined with the appearance of the water elemental giant and the color of the gemstones, how could everyone not guess that these were dropped by the earth elemental giant? They were sparkling, and seemed to have the majestic aesthetic of the earth. They were like the most elegant yellow gemstones. Of course, without looking at the cracks, it was indeed so. Kant frowned slightly and turned to look at the leader of the trade caravan. His tone was somewhat helpless as he said, then, my dear leader of the trade caravan, I wonder if this kind of gemstone will be adored by the nobles of the kingdom of Vaidyrs? The leader of the trade caravan had an awkward expression. Lord, these cracked gemstones are not for sale. Chapter 107, The Rider of Sarrand. The demand for gemstones in the continent of Cavalry was not that great. Although the gemstones were expensive, due to the constant wars on the continent of Cavalry and its culture, these hard currencies like gold and silver were the things that crazed by the nobles. After all, there were times when these little white and yellow cuties could be used as dinar. As for sparkling gems, their values were much lower. They were most likely inlaid on wedding rings and necklaces, the best accessories for pursuing certain ladies or noble women. That was why the leader of the trade caravan from Vaidyr was somewhat embarrassed. After all, Kant was generous to him after coming to this miracle land, and he knew it. If he were to treat some of the worst-tempered lords on the continent of Cavalry like this, they would probably order their elite troops and rob his trade caravan. If he was lucky enough to survive, he would report it to the lord of his own city. But when they wanted to investigate this matter, he could only blame some bandits. The lord who actually robbed him would never took any responsibility at all. I'm very sorry, my lord, the leader of the trade caravan sighed. Kant chuckled, there's no need to apologize. This has nothing to do with you. This was a rule from the system. The leader of the trade caravan could not change anything. Moreover, just because these trade caravans did not bought these inferior gemstones, it did not mean that the dukedom of Leo or the merchants of other races would not took them. Although these shiny little cutie was broken and cracked, it still had some value after polished. After handing these 7 pale yellow gemstones and 2 pale blue gemstones to Manad, Kant said with a sense of relief, keep these little cuties well. We might need them in the future. Definitely, Manad nodded and carefully kept them in his pocket. All the elemental giants had been taken care of. If he wanted to summon them again, he would have to wait 6 days. He had only saw a few words about the giants in the Academy's books, which made Kant thought that these elemental giants were extremely powerful. But now it seemed that he was really disappointed. They were all taken care of by the Ravenstern Rangers after 2 rounds of shooting. It really made him shook his head. He was bugged by the elemental giant's weakness, and also marveled at the Ravenstern Rangers' strength. But he did not think too much. If the supernatural powers in this world were really powerful, then the political system in this world would no longer be dominated by the noble families, but by the mages who had completely mastered the supernatural powers. The ruling system was set up for the strong, not to protect the weak. In some novels and games in his previous life, there were many examples of mages with great power forming a country. Kant did not dwell on this matter. As long as he had absolute strength and ensured his troops were extremely powerful, that would be enough. Strength was the root. Turning his head slightly, Kant swept his gaze over the troops that were still waiting for him. He turned his head and instructed Phirantus, "All of you, disband. You guys are too cautious, it's unnecessary to mobilize so many people." But Phirantus said seriously, "Protecting your safety is our most important mission." This was a compliment, but it was also sincere. Kant smiled and shook his head, but he did not reply. He just turned his head to Manit and ordered him, "You bring the leader of the trade caravan back. As for the materials that need to be purchased now, it will be up to you to decide. You just need to report the final results to me. I think you are the best at these things." "Understood," Manit nodded respectfully. "Oh right," Kant thought of something and instructed Phirantus, "All the Swadian footmen and the desert bandits who participated in the killing of the elemental giants will stay behind. I have other arrangement." "Yes, Lord Kant," Phirantus replied and began to make arrangements. As the order passed down, everyone began to dismiss in front of the city gate. Kant came from the modern era, and he did not learn many management methods. However, to make the best use of everything, placing talents in their most suitable positions would allow the entire team to perform at their best status. And this was the best management method to support the Oasis lookout currently. Although he did not know how to command in large-scale battles, nor did he know how to use commercial and economic methods. But as a lord, he only need his subordinates knew how. For example, Phirantus and Manit were his best men. The 2 pages of rare items were carefully placed in the wooden box once again. The box was held in the arms of a Swadian footman, who looked very serious. If anyone dared to approach this box, he would pull out his sword and interrogated that person, except Kant of course. This was something Kant asked him to keep. Other than his lord, anyone who dared to take it would die. The Ravenstern Rangers on the city wall left quickly. They wanted to return to their posts at the top of the council hall. They used linen to pull out tents in all 4 corners to shade the sun. They also set up tables and chairs for them to rest. As the highest point of the Oasis lookout, their workload was quite heavy. The Swadian heavy cavalries were also dismissed by Phirantus and returned to their own space to wait for orders. The east side of the city gate became empty. Only 41 Swadian footmen and 20 desert bandits remained here. They looked at Kant with eager eyes and stood energetically under the sun. No matter how much sweat dripped down from their cheeks, they all wanted to leave a good impression in front of their lord. However, what was arranged for them was not a mission at all. It was a level up. That's right. After the battle that killed the elemental giants, there were already some soldiers who able to level up. The most important ones were the Swadian footmen, who belonged to the intermediate troop class, as well as the desert bandits. Open the level up the interface. Kant muttered in a low voice, his thought connected to the system. The dialog box instantly popped up on his screen. The interface of the troop class was clearly visible. Upgradable troop class, Swadian light footmen x4 men. Cost 20 dinars per person, upgradable to, Swadian footmen / Swadian heavy cavalry. Upgradable troop class, desert bandits x40 men. Cost 25 dinars per person, upgradable to, elite desert bandit. Ding, you have surplus experience points. Your forces could be upgraded consecutively. However, the dialog box that popped up stunned Kant. It was both expected and unexpected. Only 4 Swadian light footmen can be leveled up. As for the desert bandits, all 40 of them could be leveled up. They could even choose to level up more as they had extra experience points. This was simply a difference in treatment. Kant frowned, and his mind continued to connect to the system. He asked his golden finger, is it a cheat in the calculation of experience points? Why is the level up of the Swadian footmen so little? The system's calculation is absolutely correct. The system answered straightforwardly, recently, there have been a lot of troop class investments in the campaign. The gain of the Swadian footmen's experience points is very low, so only 4 of them can level up. As for the desert bandits, they have fought larger battles, so the experience points is enough for all of them to level up. At the same time, there is an additional reminder. The experience points of the 5 Sarrand horseman riders is close to completion. After fighting the same scale battle, the experience points they gained are enough for them to level up to Mamluk. This Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. The system was right. The 40 desert bandits led by the 5 Sarrandian horseman riders this morning had defeated and severely injured about 500 Jack Allans. Among them, 120 Jack Allans were captured. Their battle merits were definitely enough to level up. Kant shrugged helplessly and asked, so, the troops that are produced alone do not share the experience points with other troops? That's right, the system answered crisply. Kant could only nodded. Level up the Swadian light footmen to Swadian heavy cavalry, level up all desert bandits as well. Ding, system prompt. This level up will cost 1080 dinar. Yes/no? The official system prompt arrived. How could Kant choose no? He followed the process and said, yes, level up. The moment he chose, the data flow instantly spread. 4 Swadian light footmen were surrounded. In just a few seconds, the fully armored Swadian heavy cavalries appeared on the open ground. They had a completely different looks compared to the remaining 37 Swadian light footmen. Everyone dismiss, Kant ordered them. The 4 Swadian heavy cavalries, who had completed their level up, immediately led their warhorse in the direction of the heavy cavalry troop. The 37 Swadian light footmen, on the other hand, were still divided into patrol squads. They continued to patrol according to their last mission. The only difference was that they were missing 4 companions. At this moment, the 40 desert bandits next to them also completed their level up. Their leather armor had been completely changed into iron-plated leather armor. Their scimitars and spears remained the same. 4 short javelins had been upgraded to 6 short javelins. They rode on their desert horses and waited for orders neatly. On the whole, they did not seem to have changed much. But the aura that belonged to the bandits was even more ferocious. They could be called the wild outlaws of the Sarrand desert. Ding, an additional upgradable troop class has been discovered. Upgradable troop class, Elite Desert Bandit times 15 people. Cost 30 dinar per person, upgradable to Sarrandian Horseman. Kant naturally chose to level up as well. Sarrandian horsemen who were wearing Sarrandian scimitar, holding a Sarrandian sword, and also having a long lance and shield appeared in this world. They rode on a Sarrandian horses with a headscarf and iron helmet on his head. This was a different style of dressing compared to the Swadian people. They were also elites on the battlefield and were good at charging into battle. This is not bad, Kant nodded. The level up of the 15 Sarrandian horsemen had saved the disappointment of the Swadian light footmen who could not level up. Currently, Kant had 20 Sarrandian horsemen and 25 desert bandits. In addition, he could recruit 20 desert bandits every week from now on. In a short period of time, he could have a pure light cavalry unit. Although due to the equipment, their close combat ability was still poor. However, as a spear cavalry unit, the impact force that appeared when they charged was still not something that the infantry could compare to. Furthermore, the 20 Sarrandian horsemen in iron armor could act as the support in close combat. As long as they were not involved with the infantry, they would leave the range of the infantry at the cost of injury and death. If they were to charge back again, the infantry formation would be broken sooner or later. This was the role of the assault cavalry. Chapter 108, Daily Construction Work. After the level up of the troop class, all of them were in high spirits. 20 Sarrandian horsemen and 25 elite desert bandits. These people could be considered to be the foundation of the light cavalry unit. In the next few weeks, they would recruit more desert bandits and the light cavalry unit would be successfully formed. Small-scale sweeping, assaulting, and scouting could be handed over to them. This could undoubtedly prevent the Swadian heavy cavalry unit, who were the trump cards, from going out and doing meaningless missions. A heavy cavalry unit could easily break through the enemy formation and could be said to be invincible on land. Hence, using the heavy cavalry for the jack-allans that scattered in the Naran desert would be overkilled. It was not a wise choice to send them for easy jobs. Instead, it was the light cavalry that were the best at solving such problems. Dismiss, continue to guard the captives. Kant instructed the leveled-up Sarradians, don't let our dinar escape. He was referring to the jack-allans who were tied up and squatting in the training ground with their heads lowered. The development of the Oasis lookout and the increase of the military strength depended on the dinar brought back by the Jacqueline captives. This was a precious resource for the system to exchange for dinar. It was strategic useful. Understood. Sarrandian horsemen and the elite desert bandit replied in a deep voice. These standard soldiers and the elite desert bandits revealed the striking manner and aura. After an orderly response, they spread out as fast as they could, but they did not leave the training ground too far. They made some sort of a cage formation, trapping the Jacklands captives inside. If these captives dared to cause trouble, they would have hard time to deal with the soldiers with scimitars. Kant nodded, that's right. Currently, the 50 Swadian heavy cavalries were his trump card. They were the main force that he relied on to resist the other forces. Hence, Kant would not send them to some small-scale sweeping operations. They would only serve as the guarding force of the Oasis lookout. Kant had already made his decision. In the next few days, the light cavalry formed by the Sarrandans would be the main force that would take the initiative to attack the enemy. The weekly recruitment quota of 20 desert bandits was a huge amount. Level up of troop class was settled. Kant himself became idle. Many matters were settled by Phirantus and Manad. As a lord, he only needed to make final decisions and listen to reports. This was one of the benefits of having talent and being good at using it. He walked out of the city gates. Kant planned to inspect the agricultural area. After all, these 10 acres of barren land were related to the future grain storage in the Oasis lookout. As a lord, he could not be too optimistic and relax. Moreover, he had just completed a mission and had a mission reward. 5 sand grouse nests and 10 desert bee nests. These were all be related to agriculture. The animal husbandry industry has also begun to develop. Kant pondered for a bit. After turning the city wall to the east side, many peasants were busy using tools or homemade wooden farm tools, carefully watering these barren sand lands and modifying the water channels. They ensured that the existing 7.5 acres of barley fields and 5 acres of date palm plantation could be fully hydrated in this hot weather. When the city wall was built, it completely separated the residential area from the agricultural area. At the same time, the spring water, which was originally the source of irrigation, was covered inside the city wall and became the exclusive water source behind the council hall to supply the water for the entire fortress. At the same time, the irrigation of the entire agricultural area was completely dependent on the small lake that also connected with the underground water. It was not difficult to transform the canal, they just need to dig out the canal. However, the real issue was the slightly sandy ground. As the water was poured into the canal, there must be a peasant kept patrolling and maintaining the status of canal at all times. Otherwise, the flowing lake water would cause the soft sand to collapse, this would cause the canal to be blocked in many places and lose its irrigation function. For example, currently the peasant had to hold a torch and check the canal before going to bed at night. However, when they woke up the next morning, the canal that had been maintained last night was still collapsed by the lake water, blocking the flow of the canal. They had to continue to maintain and repair it in the early morning. Otherwise, the blockage of the canal would affect the water content of the ground. The temperature of the Sarrand desert was very high. Within half an hour of noon, the surface temperature could rise to 70 degrees Celsius. The high surface temperature increased the evaporation of the ground, and the water content of the ground would decrease. This was not a good news for the date palm tree and the seeds that were still germinating in the wheat fields. I remember that after the fortress is upgraded, there will be related buildings. Kant glanced at the busy peasant with their farm tools, and he was slightly touched by it. His mind contacted the system. As the dialog box popped up, there was indeed a canal in the agricultural building. As a system building, its durability was much better than the original canal he dug. Build the canal, Kant directly ordered the system. Ding system prompt. Building the canal costs 100 dinars and takes 3 days. The system gave a reply. To Kant, this was just pocket money to him. However, it would still take 3 days to build the canal. Him felt that it was a bit too long. However, as he swept his gaze across the crooked canal, Kant could not help but frown and said in a deep voice, "The construction is confirmed." The buildings produced by the system were of the best quality. With the current buildings in the Oasis lookout, it was clear that the buildings produced by the system were of the best quality. Based on the design of standard Swadian buildings, there was also a little bit of modification for the desert area, which made the buildings more suitable to be built in the desert. Ding system prompt. Since your Trondheim is currently at the fortress level, the village level settings will no longer be used for the buildings. Currently, multiple buildings can be built at the same time without additional construction costs. The system prompt immediately appeared on Kant's screen. This was one of the benefits of upgrading to the fortress level up. Not bad, Kant nodded and smiled. Although the extra construction did not cost much dinar, he would save as much as he could. He did not had much dinar left. Not far away, behind a dune, construction workers arrived with a carriage. The Ravenstern ranger who had discovered this beforehand and reported the situation to the messenger downstairs. Then, 10 Sarrandian horsemen rode over to inspect it. After learning that it was a construction team that was building a canal, the horsemen accompanied them. This time, it was still Sunno's construction team. When they arrived at Kant's location, they immediately began to build the canal. "Is your leader not here?" Kant asked these construction workers. He looked around at these people. However, there were only 10 construction workers and a carriage carrying wood and stone. Kant was slightly curious as he did not see the chubby construction leader that he often saw. "My lord, our leader is busy recruiting workers." One of the construction workers bowed respectfully and replied, "But he still asked me to pay his highest respect to you." "All right." Kant nodded. It was really the style of that chubby construction leader. He continued to chat with the construction workers. Kant actually found that this chubby leader had already made a fortune. Not only did he recruit more construction workers, but he also hired many engineers and contracted many projects in Sunno and the surrounding villages. He was clearly a new construction giant. According to the workers, even the fat juicy job such as Sunno's city wall maintenance project had already been taken down by this fat man. Tisk tisk, Kant shook his head. This fat man was indeed a businessman. The basic channel of the canal had already been dug by the peasant. Therefore, the work of the construction workers became simple. They only needed to use stones to compress the canal and let the lake water flow on these neatly cut stones that looked like bricks. So the water did not contact with the sandy soil. Moreover, there were 20 centimeters of paved roads on both sides of the canal for the peasant to walk on when irrigating the farmland. Right. Kant looked at the canal being built, and the land could finally be irrigated more adequately. He was very satisfied. However, the earthy yellow barren sand made Kant frown slightly. As if he had thought of something, he turned his head to call a few peasant and ordered, "There is some soil outside the east city gate. Pull all of it over and sprinkle it on these wheat fields." "Understood," the peasant nodded and immediately picked up the rattan baskets and tools to go to the city gate. What Kant was talking about was the 7 piles of soil outside the city wall. These soil were formed after the earth elemental giants being killed, and their body crumbled and scattered. It looked very fertile and was better than the sandy soil. Soon, the peasant came back with rattan baskets on their backs. There was a lot of fertile soil, which they scattered in the wheat field as a fertilizing soil. "This is enough," Kant nodded while watching at the scene. From now on, the earth elemental giants could be summoned every week. After killing those giants, the fertile soil would be sprinkled in the agricultural area over the time. It would definitely improve the quality of the soil and made the soil fertile. In Kant's opinion, this was like ready-made fertile soil. Kant continued to walk forward. After bypassing the city wall that was half a meter high, he arrived at the junction of the date palm jungle and the wheat field. 10 one-humped camels were being raised here. Due to the shade of the trees, it was neither hot nor cold. The food trough was filled with grass made from chi grass. These camels chewed and digested it slowly, turning it into energy stored in the humps. Kant strolled around. The branches and leaves of the date palm tree blocked most of the sunlight. Even though the light was a little dim, the temperature was really pleasant. It was comparable to the council hall under the Sunday. Date palm tree had the function of regulating the temperature. Planting date palm tree in the Middle East desert could also protect the growth of other delicate crops. For example, beets, melons, and chickpeas could all rely on the shade of the date palm tree to grow perfectly. This was also one of the famous crop ecosystems in the desert of the Middle East. It was worth a try to do it in this world. Use the card. Kant communicated with his mind. The 3 mission rewards he had just received could be used under the shade of these trees. Desert environment was suitable for the sand grouse and desert bees, they were the good things. Chapter 109, The Beginning of the Sugar Workshop. The Mind Communication System. The 2 cards in Kant's mind instantly turned into a golden light. Data flew and shot out from Kant's eyes, but before he could arrange it, they had already materialized. 5 chicken coops made of straw and wood, about half the height of a person, were placed side by side on the west side of the city wall, close to the city wall area. Next to them were the canals that were carefully compacting and laying stone bricks and slabs by the construction workers. Coo coo coo. The sound of grouse crowing could be heard continuously in the coop. Kant could even see a few small heads poking out from the small doors of the 5 coops. Brown feathers and black pearl-like eyes were looking around curiously, looking at the construction workers who were still busy not far away. They made a few soft cuckoo sounds again. It was very strange. There are bees. So many. Oh, be careful. In the date palm jungle, the peasant who had been loosening the soil with tools cried out in surprise. They did not had time for their work. They threw down their tools and ran out with their hands covered their hands. Above their heads, many small dots that looked like flying insects were circling. Kant turned his head and looked. In the middle of the date palm forest, 10 wooden boxes were placed there. They were the artificial beehives that had been developed by the Swadian beekeepers. These desert bees arrived at the new place, they were flapping their wings and flying out of the beehives. The bees kept buzzing around, they flew across the entire date palm jungle and even flew to the desert outside the city wall. They were trying to find out where they were. At the edge of the date palm jungle, every peasant were looking worried. The desert bees were moving in groups, like dark clouds. There were probably no less than 1,000 of them. Chirp, chirp, crip. Just as this group of desert bees just flown out of the date palm jungle, a few small birds that were living in the oasis lookout flew out. Each of them grabbed the bees in their mouths. When they landed on a branch, they stretched out their necks and swallowed the bees into their stomachs. Tilting their small heads, they flew back into the swarm of bees. It was clear that they treated these desert bees as insects that came from nowhere. However, these small birds had only flown a few times to eat many desert bees. When they flew past the coop, the brown figure flapped its wings and pounced out, squishing the bird under its body. It used its stiff beak to peck the birds a few times, and then the birds died. Surprisingly, it was a male grouse with a strong body and a crown on its head. Behind it, there were female grouses that were smaller in size but extremely well proportioned. They all looked around in confusion. They flapped their wings and were not afraid of people. They just pecked at the sand on the ground. 5 male grouse and 45 female grouse. Kant swept his gaze across the 5 chicken coops. He could not help but shook his head and laughed at himself at the happy life of these 5 roosters. My life is not even as good as chicken, he complained helplessly. Although the development of the estate would only be complete if there were women, the development of the Oasis lookout was still in its early stages. Women were a burden, even if Kant really wanted to have some women. The system had to give the men of Trondheim some gentle and beautiful women. As for the local women in this world, Kant did not trusted them and would not brought them back. Kant had this mentality when he killed that woman with ulterior motives. He shook his head and did not took this matter to heart. As for the peasants standing outside the date palm jungle, they were in a daze because the swarm of bees buzzed over their heads but did not attack them. These desert bees don't sting us. A peasant suddenly realized and his eyes were filled with relief. Although the desert bees were not highly toxic bees, the sting was still unbearably painful and the pain would last for more than 10 days. If it was not necessary, no one would want to get close to where these bees were, so that they would not be covered in pain from the sting. Now that the bees did not sting people, the peasant farmers smiled. This way, they could continue to enter the date palm jungle and get busy with their tools. Someone bring some grain. Kant also reached out to the peasant next to him and ordered, go to the warehouse and get some grain. I'll leave the task of feeding these grouse to you every day. I hope you won't make a mistake. Yes, my lord, the peasant nodded respectfully. The grains were quickly brought over. They were all full and high-quality wheat. It was more than enough to make white bread. Since he had these grouses, Kant did not want to be stingy. As the peasant sprinkled the grains one by one, 50 grouse in total cried out and scrambled to peck at the grains on the ground. Soon, half a bag of wheat grains was sprinkled out. These grouses also straightened up in satisfaction. Occasionally, they lowered their heads to peck at the sands to help digest them. They walked in all directions as if they were patrolling their own estate. Although there was a gap of 1 meter on each side of the city wall, these sand grouses never escaped. Occasionally, there were sand grouses that entered the lake and nearby the chi grass field. Following the peasants' shouts, they all returned in a short while. It was like they were domestic chickens that had been raised for a long time. Kant looked at the chicken coop and beehive with satisfaction, as expected of the reward given by the system. It truly showcased the saying that the products of the system must be of the highest quality. From the very beginning, the system resolved the trouble of Kant on the process of domesticated these grouses. There's another card. Kant raised his head slightly and glanced across the date palm trees. The crispy green and silk soft leaves of date palm tree added a paradise greenery to this earthy yellow desert. On top of the straight tree, the beneath of the long swirling leaves looked empty, as if something was missing. The fresh date palm had been plucked, and there was still dried date palm in the storeroom. For the Oasis lookout where fruits were lacking, date palm was a popular item as it rich in sugar content. At the end of almost every meal, each person would be given 3 date palms as snacks. The delicious sweetness filled the mouth, and its soft texture was like a high-quality candy bread. Date palm was an addicting dessert after a meal, and it was also a reward for the tiredness of the day, a highly efficient energy source to replenish the tired body. Kant's lips curled up slightly. There will be honey to eat in the future. His mind connected to the card in his mind, and the golden card instantly burst out with countless dense data streams. Like a gust of wind, it appeared magically from the void and swept across all 5 acres of the date palm jungle. A lot of data stuck to the date palm tree. But when the data streams disappeared, the dense white flowers were swaying under the long green leaves. And right in the middle of the white flowers, the small fruit was showing its embryonic form. The sweet fragrance of the date palm tree blossomed in the entire agricultural area. The desert bees that were flying around seemed to have found their home. They gathered instantly, flapping their wings and jumping into the white flowers. Their bodies were covered with pollen from the stamens before they flew towards their hive. Obviously, this was the most common honey-gathering life of the desert bees. With honey and date palm, perhaps the sugar workshop can arrange for people to start working. Kant looked at the desert bees going in and out in the hive and thought. Due to the scarcity of raw materials and the lack of manpower, they had not started making any sugar at the moment. However, there was only one sugar that could be made in the sugar workshop, and that was the date palm sugar. However, according to the Sarrandan people, this sugar was actually made by grinding the date palm into powder and used as a condiment or something to drink. Open the building interface. Kant mind-controlled the system. On his retina, a dialog box popped up. Sugar workshop, civilian building. A small house made of wood with complete tools inside. Arrange for a peasant to move in and use raw materials to make various types of sugar. Currently available for making, date palm sugar, honey date palm sugar. Kant raised his eyebrows. Originally, he could only make date palm sugar, but now there were 2 types of sugar that could be made. But looking at those simplified words, Kant smiled wryly. It was basically honey and honey mixed with date palm sugar. In a sense, it could not be compared to real sugar like granulated sugar and malt sugar that was still a concept of ingredients. Ding side quest released. Side quest, the beginning of the sugar workshop. Reward, peasant woman x50. Introduction, sugar is an expensive luxury product. To a certain extent, it is more valuable than salt. Now that you have the raw materials, you may try to make any type of sugar. Of course, if the level of the sugar you make is high enough, then congratulations. Your estate has another precious product that can be used as a trade item. Want to try it? Perhaps you should try it. This kind of delicious luxury product is an irresistible temptation. The system's temporary side quest dialog box popped up in Kant's retina. Peasant woman. Kant was shocked. He didn't care about the mission this time. Instead, he directly stared at the reward. After all, the reward for this mission was an unexpected female peasant, not a male peasant. With a bitter smile on his face, Kant realized that the system probably could not stand it anymore. There was only male peasants in his own estate. But when he thought about it carefully, he understood. There were more tasks now. Whether it was feeding the grouse or organizing the beehive, it was easier for the tender women to do it. There was also the work in the kitchen, including the work in the sugar workshop. The peasant women were much better than the farmers who were more suitable for delicate work. The appearance of a peasant woman at this time was just right for the current situation. In that case, Kant chuckled. Of course, he chose to accept this mission. It was just making honey date palm sugar. For the Sarrandan people in the desert, it was not a difficult technology. Chapter 110, Boiled Sugar Cubes. Honey date palm sugar was piece of cake for the people of Sarrandan who were good at growing date palm and keeping bees. This temporary side quest from the system was not a problem. Kant returned to the stronghold and went to the sugar workshop. It was probably because he had not used it for a long time, the tools and utensils inside were covered in dust. But overall, the sugar workshop was tidy and all the tools and utensils were in good condition. While checking, 2 strong Sarrandian horsemen strode over. When they saw Kant standing in the room, they gently knocked on the door and bowed respectfully. Lord Kant, you were looking for us. That's right, Kant nodded. When they returned to the stronghold, he instructed the peasants to run errands and call 2 Sarrandians over. As the Lord summoned them, the 2 Sarrandian horsemen who were the most senior among the group of Sarrandans, these 2 Sarrandian horsemen who were both level 4 troop class, came over to wait for orders. Kant did not care about that and asked, "Do you know how to make sugar?" Sugar. The 2 Sarrandian horsemen looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. After hesitating for a moment, they did not answer yes or no. Instead, they said, "We know how to make date palm sugar. We have seen the craftsmen of the sugar workshop making it before." There was hesitation in their words. Clearly, they were not confident enough. Kant nodded. "So, you haven't made it yourself?" "I'm sorry, Lord Kant." The 2 Sarrandian horsemen lowered their heads in shame. Obviously, this was the reason why they were not confident enough. As level 4 elite cavalry, they were better at drawing their elite scimitars and fighting the enemy on the battlefield. They were not here to discuss the problem of making sugar with Kant. People specialized in different specialties, so Kant was calm. After a slight pause, Kant raised his head and asked, "Then do you know the process?" "Yes," the 2 nodded. Kant smiled and said, "Then it's simple. It's enough to know the process." Although he had not personally made it, it was enough to know the process of how to make sugar. After all, the technical skill of making sugar was not complicated. If he knew the process in advance, he could try it a few more times to successfully make the sugar. Soon, the tools and utensils in the sugar workshop were cleaned. Even the fire had been lighted up. The charcoal that had been accumulated was crackling and burning inside, glowing with a fiery red light. "My lord, the honey has been brought." Sarrandian horseman walked over quickly from outside the door. He was holding a small urn in his arms. A sweet smell faintly came from inside. "Well done," Kant nodded and reached out to take it. The amber-colored honey was half filled. This was the stock of the 10 hives. Of course, he didn't ask the horseman to take out all of it, but only a little. After all, the desert bees couldn't reproduce without the honey as food. And right next to it, on the stove of the sugar workshop, the sweet smell was spreading. An iron pot was boiling the grind date palm powder. The reddish-brown liquid inside the pot gradually became thicker. This was the sugar content in the date palm powder. "Add honey." Kant had already heard about the sugar boiling process described by the Sarrandian horseman. He tilted the pottery pot filled with honey and poured the amber-colored sweet honey into the iron pot, mixing it with the cooked date palm powder. At the same time, the horseman beside him kept stirring the honey with the wooden stick. When the fragrance was strong, he sprinkled some flour into the pot. Soon, the liquid in the iron pot became very thick. "It's almost done." The 2 Sarrandian horsemen looked at each other and saw the joy in each other's eyes. The reddish-brown thick liquid became sticky. It was a little difficult to stir it with the wooden stick, but this was the moment when the date palm honey sugar was almost finished. The reddish-brown liquid in the iron pot could be called the sugar liquid. "Very good," Kant nodded in satisfaction. This was the first time he boiled sugar. His luck was really good. The 2 Sarrandian horsemen did not relax. They carefully poured the sugar liquid inside the iron pot into a container prepared by the side. After it cooled slightly, they used their hands to pat and fix the shape. After it was completely cooled, they cut it into pieces, and it became a extremely high sugar content and rich honey-flavored date palm honey sugar. If they added some dried fruit crush, this would become the favorite delicacy of the Sarrandan people. However, the Oasis lookout didn't have any dried fruit currently. The sugar quickly cooled down. Taking out the scimitar in his scabbard, the Sarrandian horseman cut it into finger-sized pieces. The red-brown color of date palm was very eye-catching, and the alluring sweet scent was even more wonderful. "Lord, please try it," the 2 said respectfully. "Okay," Kant didn't refuse. He picked up a piece and put it in his mouth. As he bit down, the rich sweet taste of date palm instantly filled his entire mouth. Mixed with the fragrance of honey, his tongue could feel the astonishing sweetness of sugar, and his saliva could not stop flowing out. At the same time, a dialog box instantly popped up on his retina. Ding! After your continuous research, you have mastered the technology of making sugar. Side quest, the beginning of the sugar workshop completed. Reward, peasant women times 50. Introduction, able to eat sugar is undoubtedly a happy thing. It is the same for the peasants. This taste brings happiness and can make people forget their worries. The power of sugar is no less than salt at certain times. Side quest completed. Kant looked at the hundreds of sugar cubes in front of him. Their reddish-brown appearance was quite attractive. Put them away, he instructed the two horsemen. At the same time, he said, clean up this workshop. I think that in the future, there will be quite a number of peasant women in our estate who will specialize in making sugar. Yes, my lord, the two nodded. The mission was completed. Kant walked toward the council hall. After that, when the peasant women arrived, they would be responsible for the sugar-making tasks. Walking on the street, Kant turned his head to look at the empty sandy ground around him. He had some thoughts in his mind. Next, he would not only lead his troops to take back the salt mines and wipe out the Jack Allens, but also open up a trade route as soon as possible. Baron Dillon could not wait for too long. Moreover, after Kant brewed these sugar cubes, he realized that he could add syrup into the future trade. The dukedom of Leo was also scarce of sugar. Even this reddish-brown sugar, which was similar to snacks, was also a rare commodity in the dukedom of Leo. Perhaps it couldn't be compared to the white granulated sugar that circulation among the noble families, but these reddish-brown sugar cubes could be used as an alternative luxury ingredient to be used by the kitchens of those noble banquets, adding some sweetness to the dull dishes. Even Kant, the young noble son, could not find any fault with it. This proved that the production of date palm honey sugar cubes was completely successful. They walked into the council hall. At the top of the hall, the Ravenstern Rangers passed on the news that some strangers had arrived. Kant knew that these were the 50 peasant women who had arrived in the distant continent of Caradia. My lord. The leader of the trade caravan and Manad were still chatting, but when they saw Kant entered, they stood up and bowed respectfully. How is it? Kant asked. 120 Jack Allen slaves have all been bought, Manad replied. We have obtained 3,600 dinar, he paused and then reported, but I also bought some grain, oil, linen, and some tools. You decide, Kant trusted him. Understood, Lord Kant, Manad nodded solemnly. The leader of the trade caravan was envious. After all, it was not easy to gain the trust of a lord. Thinking about himself, he had once entered the battlefield as Vaidyr's horseman. Later, he was injured and became the leader of the trade caravan. Only then did he gain part of the trust of Lord Rivadon. Only he knew how it felt. The business was basically done, and the three of them began to chat in the council hall. Not long after, a Swadian footman, who was the guarding outside, walked in and reported, My lord, there are 50 peasant women outside. They say they are here to seek refuge with you. Yes, I understand. Kant nodded. The guard retreated and returned to stand guard outside the door. Kant turned to Manad and ordered, You can take care of these peasant women. Understood, Manad nodded. However, Kant knocked on the table with his finger, his tone was also somewhat playful. Don't let these peasant women be together with those peasants. I don't want these peasant women to have big bellies and not be able to do some tasks when the workload is heavy. Don't worry, Manad also nodded solemnly. Kant was telling the truth. The current Oasis lookout was in a period of rapid development. It was changing almost every day. At the same time, the rapid development brought heavy and miscellaneous works. Now that these 50 peasant women had arrived, they needed to make the best use of these peasant women. The peasant women could easily handle the miscellaneous tasks. They could even let the peasant women be in charge of boiling salt. But this was the real world after all. Kant's joke could indeed came true. If those peasant bachelors really took a liking to these peasant women, and something happened that shouldn't have happened, it would only do more harm than good to the current Oasis lookout. Kant did not want to have a group of children born in his own estate. Moreover, Trondheim was a fortress. It was mainly for military, livelihood of people as second priority. If such a situation really happened, Kant would rather have soldiers than pregnant women who needed long-term care. These problems are easy to solve. Kant exhaled and his expression gradually became solemn. The natural salt mine had once again been occupied by Jack Allen. He needed to continue to lead a team to sweep the area. Within this month, the first-class fine white salt would appear in Baron Dillon's Stone Pass. It would become Kant's first good start to this guy, ensuring that in the future, Oasis Lookout would no longer become attention of most of the forces in the Dukedom of Leo.